I saw the BPM masterclass with Mr. Bill, where he mentioned an idea he got from woulg about amplifying the nearly inaudible tail of a reverb in order to access the low-resolution artifacts lurking down there. Using this technique with the Octatrack provides valuable insights into the nature of each of the reverbs, as well as interesting and surprisingly usable raw audio material. I'm starting from a completely blank project, and I'm going to leave the Octatrack set to 16-bit. The resolution you choose to work with has a large effect on these very low-level artifacts, so make sure to experiment with both bit depths. I'm going to turn on dynamic recorders to make sure that I can capture very long reverb tails. And I'm also going to go into the System Personalize menu to make sure that I have enabled Preview Without Effects. Now it's time for a sound source. You can use pretty much anything you want, but I'm going to be using a short blip of a sine wave, making sure I have time stretch off, and I'm going to be using the Adventure Kid Waveform's Perfect Waves sine wave. Let's take a listen to that. And I forgot to set it to loop. I'll use the Flex Machine playback settings to force it to loop. Okay, now it's time to shorten the envelope. We're not so much interested in the sine wave itself as the decay of the reverb. Now I'm going to go into the first effects slot and turn it to none, and I'll put a dark reverb in the second effects slot. I want a sound that's fully wet, so I'm going to leave it in mix configuration, and I'm going to leave the mono turned all the way down. The mono setting has a pretty big effect on all of these artifacts. So now I'm setting the reverb fully wet, and I'm going to set it to a time of 126. A time setting of 127 is either infinite reverb or close enough to infinite that I don't want to deal with it right now. Now that the sound source is functioning properly, it's time to set up the resampling. I'm disabling the external audio inputs and changing the trig mode to 1-2 and source 3 to track 1. Using a trig behavior of 1-2 will allow me to create a recording of arbitrary length by manually stopping and starting the recording. Now I'm trigging the recording and trigging the track. Since I put a very long decay time on the reverb, I'm going to let this record for a while. You can use shorter decay times, but I found some interesting artifacts with the dark reverb on very long decay times. Let's take a look at the recording. I need to be in the record setup menu for that shortcut to work. And need to zoom out a bit there. That's long enough. Time to stop the recording. Now let's take a close look at that reverb tail. There, you can see that little blip of good stuff. We'll zoom in on that a bit. Very interesting how the reverb has put some DC offset on the signal. Now I'm going to select only the end of the reverb tail. Now I'm adjusting the start position. Since I scrolled all the way to the end, that shrunk my loop, and now extending the end point to the end of the sample. Looks like I didn't quite catch the complete end of the tail there. I was a bit impatient with my sampling time. Now to go into the Edit submenu and normalize this selection. Changing the menu, reset my zoom. Normalizing this reverb tail will add a lot of gain to it. And I'm normalizing a pretty big chunk of audio, so this is going to take a while. Skipped ahead a bit there. Now let's take a look and a listen. Well, I didn't record the very end of that reverb tail, but I still got to some very interesting stuff. I'm going to try again and be a bit more patient this time. I'm also going to change the reverb to be entirely mono. And now we're going to skip to that part where I'm normalizing the tail end of the recording. We can already see some nice action there. Let's see if I caught the actual tail. quite a different sound this time. By scrubbing around the sample, sometimes you can find some interesting places. These highly amplified low-resolution artifacts are quite filthy. Now I'm resampling the spring reverb. While performing this experiment with the spring reverb, I found out that the third spring type is inherently noisy in a way that I hadn't quite realized before. I don't show the third spring type in this demo, so make sure to go check that out for yourself. The other two reverbs can't produce nearly as long of a reverb tail, so the recordings don't need to be nearly as long to capture all of the artifacts of a high decay time. Let's see what filth we uncovered. That's pretty nice. I like it. Let's scan over these other sections to see what they're doing. The low-resolution spring character is very crunchy. Okay, now it's time for the plate reverb. I'm curious about the result if I have it set to full mono. Also note that I'm not changing the mix to send because I don't want any of the dry signal in my resample. Okay, let's skip ahead a bit and listen to that normalized reverb tail. Very cool how those low-resolution artifacts decay away into filth. And once again, we're seeing some DC offset on the output of the reverb. Unlike the dark reverb, though, this appears to be a negative DC offset instead of a positive one, at least in this particular use case. I'm going to focus in on the filth by selecting a particular portion of the reverb tail and normalizing again. Yeah, that filth is getting pretty thick. Let's zoom in on that filth. Now I'm going to scrub through that section with a loop. Okay, let's see what we can actually do with this in some sort of quasi-musical context. These very noisy and harmonically rich signals are very good for processing. To mimic scrubbing through the sample, I'm using an LFO on the start position. First, I'm going to disable both effect slots, and now it's time to get some trigs down. Time to shorten that envelope. And I want some more trigs. Now let's see if we can shape this reverb fart into something using the filter. I think I should probably switch this start position LFO to hold behavior. I suppose we could call this fart position modulation. Let's get that filter biting into this a bit more. Let's lengthen that amplitude envelope release. I'm not sure what to use for my second effect. Since this is an artifact from the reverb, the stereo image is pretty screwy, so maybe the spatializer can be helpful. Mid-side mode is very useful for adjusting stereo image. Might Might as well mess with it a bit though, and see what can happen with the stereo image now. Still lively, but not quite as problematic. Now it's time for a neighbor machine and some more effects. Let's try something time-based in this first slot. How about a chorus? Turn up the taps to maximum to make it a bit more dramatic, and I'm turning the width all the way down. Let's try putting the dark reverb on this now. I'm changing it to send, and I'm putting some pre-delay on it. Not feeling the reverb too much. I'm going to swap it for a delay. Now I'm going to go back to my source track and put some modulation on the amplitude envelope release time. And now time for some modulation on the filter width. I want some more processing, so I'm going to add another neighbor track. And on the first slot, I'm going to put a compressor to tame some of these signals. And add a bit of gain back to thicken things up. Helps to bring out some of the lower level details. Now I want that reverb back. I'll try taking down the brightness a good bit first. Now I want to tweak the delay on track 2 a bit. And time to revisit the original filter. I want a bit more motion and resonance out of it. Since I used up my LFOs for modulation, I'm going to use live record to punch in some parameter locks. With all the processing that's happening post-filter, minor tweaks can have a big effect. I want the low-pass filter frequency just high enough to bring out some of those higher frequency sounds, but not so high that we're overwhelmed with them. I'm going to take a quick glance to see how much filming time I have left. Let's do one more neighbor track on this. I'm a bit conflicted as to what I want here. How about some high and low shelf EQ? Tempted to squish this with another compressor. Yeah, I might as well throw it on there. Dialing in some gain reduction. Now to bring some gain back. Now I'm going to try emphasizing some different frequencies with the dark reverb. There's a lot of interaction between the different parts of the dark reverb, and the parameters have rather wide ranges. And it's always worth repeating the fact that the shelving frequency has an effect even with zero gain. The dark reverb can be heavily filtered due to its ability to generate very high signal levels with high mix values. Since I crossed the filter values, I'm going to turn up the mix quite a bit. And of course, increasing the time value is going to introduce a lot of energy, even in this highly filtered scenario. And at this point, even slightly on-crossing the filters is going to give a lot of signal level. Compression post-reverb is very helpful for manipulating the spaciousness and details. I didn't like those shorter attack times. They were dulling the transients too much, and also dialing in a short release time to allow the reverb tail to pop up. And this is where I needed to restart my camera, but I was pretty much done already. All I'm doing here is tweaking the same reverb parameters I was before, trying to emphasize different interesting frequency ranges. Overall, I have to say I was pleasantly surprised by how interesting and useful these artifacts can be. In many cases, though, you'll want to go through at least one or two resampling stages in order to adjust the stereo image and gain characteristics. Also, make sure to try sending through many different types of signals. I chose a simple sine wave primarily to assist education and analysis. I found it very helpful for differentiating the characteristics of the reverbs. Similarly, in this demo I stuck close to default reverb settings in order to not introduce too many confounding variables. Small parameter changes when amplifying these low-level artifacts can give very different results.